Hey everyone, welcome to the next episode of Feedback. Today we're going to be talking about Tyshawn Sorey's piece for Ross Gay that he wrote for us back in 2023. Along with Tyshawn is going to be Nate Chinen, who's going to be moderating our talk. He's an amazing jazz critic who's written for the New York Times, Jazz Times, and currently works as the editorial director at WRTI in Philadelphia. He now writes a really great Substack called The Gig, which you should definitely all check out and subscribe to. Tyshawn is a really inspiring composer and multi-instrumentalist who we've known for quite a long time from, being in the scene in New York. He's worked as a band leader for so many multiple amazing groups and worked in a lot of different formats over the years. We were really fortunate to work with him on a big performance work based on Ross Gay's book-length poem called Beholding back in 2023 down in Philadelphia. And following that, we worked together on a piece that got its premiere at the Donaueschingen Music Festival in October of 2023. That's the one that we're going to talk about, called For Ross Gay. We're really looking forward to this conversation, and thanks to you two for being here and available for the talk. So I'll turn it over to you, Nate.
Oh, thank you, Russell. That was a wonderfully gracious introduction, and what a pleasure it is to see you all in these windows today. I wanted to start. You mentioned Beholding, the piece that premiered at Girard College, and it felt like that is the natural place to begin here. I have a copy of Ross's book and thought I would actually begin by reading the beginning of his acknowledgments because it really struck me as pertinent to this piece. So this is how Ross begins the acknowledgments. Nothing I write by myself. Everything I write, by which I mean everything, I write with and for and from others, which is a way of saying always debt, which is a way of saying always gratitude, a way of saying always I am beholden. And so this book-length poem is Beholding. That's also the name of the piece that you all collaborated on. But when I read those words, Tyshawn, I felt like I could hear you literally saying them. And so I'd love to begin by asking you to reflect on that sentiment, and how it resonates with you and maybe connects you to Ross.
Well, I've always had the belief that musical notation is only one aspect of what goes into the realization of a given work. And so my opinion is that, of course, we are all beholden to each other in a lot of ways as performers. I happen to be a performer as much as, the performers of yarnwire, who, it's always inspiring to collaborate with them on any level, whether it's writing music for them or, performing with them. The thing I'll say about that is that the musical notation doesn't mean anything really without the inspiration of the people to really bring it to life and to really bring it to life in such a way that might even at times enhance my own imagination of what the piece is going to be about or what the music is going to be in the final analysis anyway. So I don't necessarily see the composer's word in my, at least in my own music, being the absolute last word, because the music is about the people with whom you're making it with. And without those people, the music wouldn't exist. So I think that's kind of how I would take that comment in terms of, the idea of the first thing that was said is that nothing I write by myself. Of course, sometimes there may be some concerns that might come up on the part of the performers that may have them asking you questions about what you decide, as the composer. And you as the composer have to be open to, answering such questions, with regard to interpretation or narrative or scope or anything like that with a piece like this for Ross Gay. So for me, it's not just about the notation alone. It's really about the people for whom you write, which is the biggest step that any composer would take in creating a piece of music anyway. I mean, it should be paramount, in terms of what the composer comes up with that can express their imagination as explicitly as possible.
Mm-hmm. As you talk about that collaborative aspect, what occurs to me first is this idea that, yarnwire is an ensemble that is, percussive in every sense, in the full possibility of that tradition. And as a composer, Tyshawn, you've written for every conceivable configuration of musicians, including voice, things that are not at all percussive. But there is a special insight that you have on an ensemble like this. And so I'll open this up to anyone. Like, can you speak to that affinity and that special insight and how it manifests in this music?
I guess maybe I have one thought. The process of beholding was like a multi-year one, and so we were extremely privileged to spend that much time with Tyshawn. It was so many visits to Philadelphia and developing the piece throughout 2 years, 2 years and a half. And there was one kind of a tipping moment, I think, for me, but I'm pretty sure for a lot of us. It was seeing Tyshawn perform in Philly during one of our visits and seeing him play the drums and the whole percussion setup really kind of like, to me, it opened a lot of kind of more insight into his musical world and his approach to percussion in general. And because we were in such an intertwined kind of artistic relationship at that time, it felt really extremely meaningful. And I'm having a hard time like putting it into words, but that was a special moment where I felt like a very particular connection with regards to like the percussive aspect of our ensemble.
To add anything like on that percussive side, it's really rare that you get to work with a composer who knows your instrument and your instrumentarium so well. It's a little, intense at first. I'm like, but then the awesome thing is, Tyshawn could ask for an Omglocken. We could talk about Omglocken and the sounds of their timbre and the right tam tam and like this kind of chime and the vibraphone and it's like already there's just a trust built in there in the language of the instruments and about color, about feeling, about vibe. And so there wasn't any kind of like skepticism on my part in terms of like, what instruments are we going to choose? What's the affect? And it became more of an artistic conversation on how to navigate those spaces. You know what I mean? And that's a really special place to be in, because usually you're reading a note on the page and it's like maybe the composer doesn't know what an instrument can do and all its various timbres and emotional qualities, but we could completely bypass that and just really get into the heart of what we're playing in relation to the poem in Beholding, or for the Donaueschingen piece, what kind of massive sound we were going to go for, so that's really very lucky, I think.
Because Beholding has at its center this basketball metaphor, as you're talking, Russell, I'm thinking about the concept of a player coach, like Steve Kerr with the Warriors. It's like he understands the player perspective. He understands the kinetics of what happens on the floor in a different way, right? Totally. Because he's been at that highest elite level himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And that's kind of what the rehearsal process was about. First, learning how to work together. Was this going to be a score that's written down? No, let's like work with the poetry. And then, learning signs, right? And conduction techniques. So it was really a process. But because we both kind of speak that percussion language, and piano for that matter, right? Like it really kind of eased a working process that might have taken probably another, and this isn't to elevate us, but like if you weren't used to that practice, it might have taken a lot longer to get to that place if we didn't already share a baseline understanding.
Tyshawn, when I was in New York reporting on the premiere of another piece of yours, Monochromatic Light, Afterlife, I talked to a number of the musicians in the ensemble, and Steve Schick said something that stuck with me, which was that he felt like, and this might have been him speaking from his position, as the percussionist in the piece, but he said, well, I feel like percussion is the universal donor of this piece, and he felt he felt very supported in the way that Russell is saying. He felt supported and understood, but he also felt an extraordinary kind of responsibility on his shoulders within that piece, which is interesting because I don't think anyone who hears Monochromatic Light thinks of it as like, well, this is a percussion piece, but there's this kind of understanding that he felt he had from his position in the ensemble. And so could you speak to that as it pertains to Yarnwire as well? This is a percussion ensemble of extraordinary flexibility and insight and subtlety. And I feel like all of those things just lend themselves so well to your voice as a composer.
Exactly. I mean, they speak to who I am. I mean, personally, the flexibility, the insight, but also the preciseness of what, each of the players are able to achieve, using their instruments and their sensibilities and their understanding of many different kinds of music, not just the music that they perform, which is the same kind of position I take in my own work. And so, and also the willingness to discover things, the willingness to find new things, and to find new ways of expressing something without, me necessarily always having to give instruction on a piece of paper. Just that way of working, I think, lends itself to many more possibilities and to many more different directions in which we can take things. Like, for example, with Beholding, I mean, I chose not to write a fixed so-called score for it, like using musical notation specifically for that reason, because I want there to be a flexibility with how I want things interpreted and how I want things to be done. And it took us, a long time for us to develop this language together, with the understanding that we do have to be flexible with each other, and we do have to have some kind of insight with what's going on with the poetry and that kind of thing. The poem and the music that supports the poem, I mean, all of these things work together equally in this way, I think. And, with Monochromatic Light, it's a similar situation where, even though I have very precise things that I'm hearing from the percussion, again, the idea of flexibility and trust, that goes into it. I mean, knowing Steve as being the reputable, outstanding percussionist he is, I mean, I have to also be trusting with the way that he decides on selecting instruments, for example, or the way he goes about articulating certain phrases and giving me, I'm learning from him just as much as, I mean, I'm learning from him. I'll just put it that way. And I mean, it's the same with Yarnwire. I mean, it's all a learning process to me. And, I could never stop learning from anyone who I work with, whether I'm writing music for them or not, no matter how specific I can be with certain things. I mean, there's always going to be something that that I'm going to learn that's new to me and that I would hope to incorporate either into that particular piece at that moment or in a future composition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I talked with Ross briefly around the time of the Beholding premiere, the thing that he mentioned that really struck him was visiting as the piece was in development, and he was so impressed by just how purely collaborative, like, it was pure invention. And Tyshawn, you spoke to that idea of, it's like, we're not going to accept this received wisdom of Western notation as our method. Like, we need to invent a new method for this communication. Did that same methodology extend to for Ross Gay? Was it building on that language?
It was building on that language, in fact. I mean, but of course, certain festivals and certain people being who they are, and when they commission music or whatever, some people expect notated material, whatever that might mean,
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, what we really have is about a 5-page score of material, that takes us about a half hour to get through, whatever. But at the same time, I don't think that the score is necessarily the be all end all in terms of how we decide to go about performing it. I mean, it could easily be an hour long piece if we want it to be, or it could be something where we decide to extend one part of the score and maybe shorten another part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm open to that flexibility as well in terms of what we can decide to do with it together. And then Donaueschingen, I mean, where we premiered it, it allowed us these options, because I think when we first played it together, and I remember, Russell and I talking about this one time, was where by reading the score and reading all of the timestamps and different things that are in the score, the piece almost felt like the intention behind it, or the intent behind every action, was too reliant on what the score was saying, whereas it was more about really making an environment together, making these different sound worlds together that shift over the course of that time. So rather than relying on the timestamps in the score, I had suggested that let's not fixate ourselves on the amount of time we have to do something, or the amount of time that we have to play one event and transfer to another. Let's
Mm-hmm.
make the music together, but have some approximation of what that timing is, and let's listen together. Like, because the music is more about listening than it is about interpreting some kind of fixed score or something like that. Like, I'm not interested in that, not for this piece anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That actually, sorry, that made me remember that when we were looking up, getting all of our stuff organized for the pop-up series at Miller at the end of this month, that I was looking for the score. And I actually do. I have two scores. I have the printed score that Tyshawn is talking about, and then I have just a blank page with my handwriting with just some sentences, which is basically a roadmap and a toolbox. What sounds are in my toolbox for all of these moments, and what am I listening for? What are my auditory cues? So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I love that idea. Like the sort of the roadmap versus the trail notes, you know. Now sonically, there's there's a lot to say about this piece, really. And thinking about Ross Gay as as the inspiration and kind of the presiding spirit, I'll just toss out a few ideas which you all can swat down or accept. But there's one sound that I wasn't sure where to place, but it's a frictive sound. It might be like a rubber mallet across a membrane, and it creates this kind of this sort of low groaning timbre. And what it made me think of, because of the context of Beholding, was the squeak of rubber sole sneakers on the hard court. Like that friction comes from somewhere, right? So let's talk about that sonic element, and tell me if I'm completely off base in terms of making that connection.
I think you're right that it is the Super Ball, the rubber ball on the bass drums. Tyshawn can speak more to the reference, but like, it is such a haunting sound that like, I mean, you're in the know, so you know what that is. But for those who don't, it's like such a haunting thing that it really kind of focuses your attention to be like, whoa, where is this coming from? How is that? And I think it's a great sound.
And I think there's a moment where we're all doing it, right? At the same time.
Yeah.
And to talk about specificity for a moment, I mean, the degree of friction too is what determines what we hear, right?
Yeah.
The degree of friction, the speed of how the ball is moving across the membrane, or even across the piano strings, or across the soundboard, or of the piano, whatever the case may be. I mean, there's all of these things that I tend to pay attention to when it comes to these things, and so. I mean, the specificity principle, I think, is also at work when we're talking about, investigating that sound world as fully as possible.
There's another, I think the moment in this piece that registers most as an event is the eruption of orchestra bells, tubular bells at one point. And this was an instrument that has a really prominent place in beholding as well. And it's so fascinating because I've back in my student orchestral percussion days, like I've played some orchestra bells, and I know what that is like. But Tyshawn, you encourage the ensemble to use them in such a way that the cacophony of it, the overtones feel almost as important, or maybe even more important than the primary pitches. So
yeah, that's exactly the point. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can any of you who play that instrument in that part attest to sort of how that feels or how it registers in the context of the piece?
I mean, I love tubular bells. I think they don't get used enough in chamber music. And so any chance we can get to play them loud and create this mass it's awesome. And I think I love those moments in beholding where we're rolling on them with yarn mallets, because it creates this kind of sheen that you can see it if you see the performance, but I think if you're listening to it, it's like, wow, what is this complex, almost electronic sound that is like a blanket everywhere. But then in this piece, when you get to play all of those bells so loud and just create that massive sound, it could be at once joyful. If you're thinking like if you're in a square in Europe or something and you hear all the church bells going, but also it has a darker side to it also because it's just so insistent and just loud, and it really isn't pitch dependent necessarily. We're just trying to make this thing. So it's it's really fun to be able to just wail.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite sections.
Yeah. Well, and both of these sounds that we're describing, or both of these sort of sonic experiences, they're uneasy. And I think that this is something that I connect with the poetry of Ross Gay. It's so human. He's very warm and funny, and personal and approachable, but he's not afraid to lean into discomfort, right? And I think that is well expressed in this piece. The totality of that as a human experience. Now, Sai could not join us for this confab, but I'd like to talk for a moment about the vibraphone and the other mallet. Now, is that glockenspiel or is it something else?
I
in this
I think it's
piece?
crotales.
Okay.
Probably we had. Yeah.
Yeah, crotales.
You know, so these elements provide us with like a clear melodic line at times, and it's hard not to associate that with a kind of protagonist in the piece, and I have to prompt myself to resist that reading. But let's talk about the role of the mallet percussion and the melodic, lyricism, and how that fits in.
Sorry, in for Ross Gay or in Beholding?
In for Ross Gay. Yeah, let's talk about this piece.
Well, I mean, I guess the melodic elements. I think this is yet another contribution to the shape of everything that's going on within the rest of the ensemble. I wanted to have these like, sort of conflicting melodic shapes that are happening underneath whatever the ensemble is doing, and what the celeste is playing as well. Because this celeste can at any moment divert from that material, into something else that's completely different and independent of what's happening with these melodic passages that the mallet instruments are asked to develop.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Where do you locate Ross in this piece? This is sort of a intentionally open-ended. Everywhere. I love that.
Everywhere in the piece, because that first statement, like I said, is what encapsulates the way that I was able to arrive at this piece. That's one way in which every element of this takes inspiration from Ross, and the other reason why I've dedicated it to him was because of his open spirit to collaborating, his open and fearless spirit to exploring certain things that maybe we hadn't thought about exploring when we were putting together Beholding, for instance. And I'll never forget the times that short as they were, I'll never forget the times that I've spent with him. And I'm thinking also about his first reading of the poem, like when he read the poem in front of us at Girard College when we first got together. We were on the outside of the campus, and he read us all 100 pages of this poem, and we were just speechless after that.
It was so weird. This is so weird. Looking like this, his hands extended timidly, a silver maple's branches creaking and swaying in a hurricane, for Doc was amongst the trees, as we call the big men like Kareem. The trees, who reside mostly in a lane or in the key, growing there, rooting, the thousands of fans now holding their breath, looking into the sky, some of their hands reaching out instinctively toward their neighbors beside them, or their palms instinctively laying on the shoulders before them, or forearms shoved gently into a wrist or hip beside them.
I mean, because of the intent with which he read this poem, but also, like, you can just, I mean, he read it in such a way that you can easily feel yourself sitting there in 1980 and witnessing Dr. J, making that shot, like, and doing the skyhook and all of that. I mean, you can just kind of imagine, you can literally imagine yourself sitting there witnessing this. I mean, that's how much he really brought that reading to life, and how much he really was able to execute the way that he intended the poem to be read. Was fascinating for me. So these are among the things that I think of, when composing for Ross Gay or whatever. I wanted Yarnwire and myself to kind of take that same feeling, and have it applied to the way we interpret the score.
Yeah, I love that story. Thank you for it, because it makes me think about the composer as performer. Once again, to have it directly interpreted by the author is really something. Yeah. So what other thoughts do any of you have as you prepare to perform this piece again, presented at the Miller Theater?
Well, one thing I was thinking about when I was re-listening to the recording is that, like any piece like this, I would say, we have a handful of pieces similar in the way that they are not fully notated, but are actually very thoroughly composed, if that makes sense. So, we don't have maybe an exact replicatable performance each time, even though the big structural elements might be the same or are the same. And so that kind of always that question in my mind of, am I trying to replicate? How much am I trying to replicate what I did before? How much am I exploring new thoughts? And, I'm knowing Tyshawn, I know he's open probably to all of those things and to some degree or another. But that's always for me personally kind of a really interesting point of negotiation is to resist my classical training and to be more open to not doing it the same way just because it worked once before.
Right. A thought occurs to me, and I'd love to hear from anyone who is interested in commenting on it. But the role of kineticism, even the parts of it that are not directly related to producing sound, I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that. Because Tyshawn, when I watch you perform, sometimes I'm thinking about movement almost in a Tai Chi kind of way, where, the musical content, so to speak, happens when the tip of a stick hits a cymbal or, a drum head. But really, the entire arc of your arm and the way your posture shifts is part of the musical expression. And because yarnwire is, whether you're playing piano or, tubular bells or bass drum or timpani or anything, that's all a part of it too, right? It's not just what happens when you strike the piano key or when your mallet touches the drum head. There's a kind of intentionality that is a part of this too. And so I wonder is this something that makes sense to you? Do you think it's a valid interpretation?
Yeah, absolutely. We in Yarnwire, we talk about that kind of stuff frequently in everything we do is, because that's part of performance. Unless you go to live performance and listen to the whole thing with your eyes closed, which sometimes I do, but many times you're watching. And so seeing the performer is part of the experience of listening, and movements guide our listening. Yeah, if you see somebody taking their arm very slowly, you wonder, where is it going to end? What's going to happen when it comes down? What's it going to sound like? And so, yeah, I think that I know that we as an ensemble, we talk about that all the time.
As percussionists, that is a natural element of what we do anyway. It's like,
right.
Movement is, you sound the way you move, right? If you, so for me, the sound is not only the sound itself, but it's what precedes that, or how you move. The sound comes before, and the result of that sound, or the afterthought of that sound will kind of give you a way to not necessarily analyze the sound you've made, but it kind of leads you to recognize, am I moving correctly?
Mm-hmm.
Or am I producing the sound in a manner that is sensible or with any kind of intent, or whatever the case may be? I think, the idea of sounding the way you move is very much a prominent aspect of not only what I do, but also what we together as a collective are able to do. And that's why I'm able to trust him to the degree that I do. And that's why, every time we've done Beholden together, like, it's always been gradually better over time, because the intent is what we're paying attention to. And the way that we are listening as an ensemble, whether or not there's a score in front of us, or the poem, or whatever suggestions they are, in front of the players, they're able to every time create a consistent level of intent that remains in such a way that is pure to how we can individually express ourselves. So the physicality of performance is just as important as the sounds that come out of it.
Yeah. Beholding, hinges on this act of impossible grace that was, witnessed by people and has since been enshrined in the popular imagination, and so it feels fitting to talk about that in these terms. In terms of the score, it was just another 2 points on the board, right? But but it's all about what happened in that moment, the transformation, everything that Ross writes about so beautifully. And so I think as a musical corollary or analog to that, Beholding was so eloquent in that regard, and I think For Ross Gay is very much in that spirit. So I really appreciate it. Well, this has been a real pleasure. And it's always great to Tyshawn. It's always great, Tyshawn, to catch up with you. And
likewise,
it's great. Yeah, it's great to speak about this terrific work. And I hope that the New York performance is a huge success.
I'm looking forward to it. Yes.
Yeah.
We are too.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Nate, and thanks, Tyshawn, for being here. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll have more episodes in the future. And thanks so much for tuning in.